Hello, my name is d-floe, and today we're going to be talking about various coloring methods. If you may remember, I used to have a tutorial up on my old channel from last year where I covered coloring in a 2-hour live stream. In case you feel like you missed out, I made this short little montage to commemorate my amazing teaching skills from 2015. Enjoy! Basically, and I'll see you guys next time. Now that I've successfully checked post-ironic sarcasm off my to-do list, it's time to actually start coloring. Today, I'll be teaching 5 different coloring methods: cel shading, enhanced cel shading, layer shading, blend shading, and ultra soft shading. Whichever ones you decide to use is entirely based on preference, and as a disclaimer, these are only my methods. There are hundreds of other ways to go about coloring, so please avoid confining yourself to only these 5. Basic cel shading is perhaps the easiest and simplest coloring method to understand. One base color and one shade. Which one you choose as the clipping mask is entirely up to you. The reason I like to keep the colors in separate layers is because even after you've chosen your colors, you can always adjust those layers and play around with the hue, saturation, and lightness. Otherwise, you may end up with a really messy cel shaded piece. So whether or not you want to do that, I may or may not suggest working on multiple layers. Enhanced cel shading is definitely more interesting, eye-catching, and experimental. It takes the simplicity of basic cel shading and adds a third layer to the mix, the core shadow. In a realism standpoint, the core shadow is the shade that borders the mid-tone and shadow, and it is the darkest point of lighting an object. This mainly has to do with how reflected light affects the remaining shadow. However, instead of just making the core shadow darker, we're also going to play with the hue and saturation so that it pops out more. The great thing about this method is that you can go pretty nuts with the color choices. How you decide to choose those colors is really about how ambitious you're willing to get and how much you may understand about color theory. I can't give you a clear and solid answer on the subject of color theory, so just do your best. Layer shading is truly the perfection of mistakes. It takes advantage of the fringe effect and shade layer modes. Whether or not you choose to include a highlight is really up to you. Personally, I wouldn't really recommend using the fringe effect on the luminosity layers because all it does is soften the edges. There's so many variables that affect the result of the piece that makes it extremely eye-catching and aesthetically pleasing. From the colors you choose to use for the shades, to the opacity of the shade, to the opacity and size of the fringe, there's really no telling how things will turn out. The combination of these 2 shade layers lets you create an interesting crossover effect, so the result of the piece will really depend on how nuts you decide to go with this method. Also, it's not really required, but I like to include a paper or canvas texture on the base color layers to add more variety. Blend shading is definitely the most down-to-earth type of shading. It only uses one layer and takes advantage of the blending function of the brush, watercolor, and blur tools. These are the settings for the 3 tools I use. Feel free to copy them and use them in your own works. The basic premise of this method is to use a lot of directional strokes. It's definitely the least technical of the 5, but it also creates a fantastic handmade feeling, and you're definitely bound to make mistakes. For smoother surfaces such as skin, you'll definitely want to use the blur tool a lot. But for harder surfaces such as hair and cloth, you'll really need to rely on your strokes and sleight of hand, which will take a lot of practice. Ultra soft shading is definitely one of my personal favorites. By using the airbrush tool and the soft eraser with several luminosity and shade layers, this type of shading creates a surrealistically smooth texture to all your objects that when done right looks beautiful. These are the settings I use on my airbrush and soft eraser. Feel free to use them in your own works.